You're watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Robert A. Manning. He's a senior fellow, Brent Scowcroft Centre on International Security and its Foresight, Strategy and Risks Initiative at the Atlantic Council, joining us from Washington, D.C. And Dr. Bill Hayton. He's an author, broadcast journalist, and an associate fellow with Chatham House. Thank you both for giving us some time.
Pleasure.
Mr. Manning, just starting with you now, I'm just going to go back to one of your articles that you wrote in 2014, where it was actually in response to many, including the former Singapore diplomat Kishore Mehbani, proclaimed author as well, who we've interviewed, who were kind of extrapolating on the "when China rules the world" theme. That's like 6 years back. And you co-wrote an article about Beijing evoking a latent anti-China coalition, which you mentioned stretched from Japan to Vietnam to India. Now, in the current scenario, 6 years later, is that latency, in your view, now transforming to potency?
Well, I think it would be a lot further along if we didn't have an American president who pursued an America First policy, because I think we're missing an opportunity, because Trump has made it a U.S. versus China issue, when in reality, it's a China versus the world issue. And we're beginning to see a backlash. The UK 5G decision is just the latest. Across the board, in popular opinion in India, it's just flipped 90% against China and so on. So I think there's a basis for putting together a broad coalition, US, Japan, Australia, India, and so on, and then trying to figure out a common position and to focus on priority issues. I think that Chinese predatory mercantilism is high on the list, and if we had put together a coalition of all the major economies and essentially went to the WTO and told China, game over, we're not going to do business this way anymore. Because what's happening now, India banning all the Chinese apps, Huawei getting shut out of US, India, and Europe, increasingly in Europe, it's starting to cost them. And that's one thing the Chinese pay attention to. And so the problem is that Trump doesn't believe in multilateral negotiation. So I think if we have a different president 6 months from now, that I think there's a lot of possibilities of really pushing back hard on China and maybe getting some diplomatic results.
Dr. Hayton, now Mr. Manning is mentioning the latest Secretary of State Pompeo's statements that have come out, where he's calling China's actions illegal and that the world won't allow it to treat the South China Sea as a maritime empire. But as Mr. Manning is pointing out, what really will or can the US actually do in the current scenario?
Well, I think the situation in the South China Sea specifically is one where the Southeast Asian states are losing out. So Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia. And they're losing out in lots of ways, mainly to do with the resources, the fish and the oil and the gas. Vietnam's just been prevented from developing its third gas project by China. Vietnam is a booming economy. It needs that gas to convert into electricity to keep the economy moving. The government needs the tax revenue, all that kind of stuff. So there are real costs for Vietnam for China's actions here. But the question is really, what is the US able to do, and what do Southeast Asians want the US to do? I mean, the US could, deploy ships as some kind of picket line to observe and, publicize, in a kind of sort of neutral, without getting involved kind of way. It might want to do that. It might want to offer its support so that, for example, if a Vietnamese or Malaysian Coast Guard vessel wanted to protect a Vietnamese oil rig, the Americans were on station. But then, of course, the question is then what would happen next? If there was a confrontation, would the US be willing to get involved? But also, do the Southeast Asians actually want the US to get involved, or would they feel that would complicate their relations with China? So, for example, Vietnam has these foreign policy positions where it says it's not going to use a third country in a dispute with another country. Would it actually want the Americans there? Maybe, maybe not. It's not clear. One issue which was, one option which was raised by Mr. Stilwell from the State Department at the CSIS conference earlier this week was the possibility of some kind of sort of financial sanctions against any Chinese companies. For example, if a Chinese company was to actually start drilling for oil in somebody else's exclusive economic zone, sanctions could be imposed against that. But obviously, that would have to happen. But if China's behaviour at the moment is about military or Coast Guard forces harassing Vietnamese or Philippine fishing or oil industry people, there isn't really much that financial sanctions can do about that specifically. That has to be more a question of sort of physical presence and deterrence.
Mr. Manning, you pointing out that it was a different president, a different administration, things would probably be different as well. But in the current scenario, do you see this building up into a confrontation, or how do you see it? Because as Dr. Hayton was pointing out, there were two carrier groups as well that the US had positioned.
I think it's an increasingly dangerous situation because you have the U.S. getting more assertive. We have an over-militarized foreign policy to start with, and since they don't seem to believe in actual diplomacy, the U.S. Navy is our major diplomat, and so we've been running these FONOPs through the South China Sea, increasingly within 12 miles of Chinese artificial islands and so on. And the problem is, if I'm Asian and I look at this and I ask the question, has anything China wants to do been stopped? And the answer is still no. And what I worry about is it's not just South China Sea, it's India, it's elsewhere. The Chinese Communist Party is pursuing what they say implementing sovereignty. So in Hong Kong and South China Sea and Himalayas. And I think the problem here is that they're trying to create a fait accompli in the South China Sea through their disruption of oil drilling. They're trying to push the Southeast Asians into abandoning their claims and accepting the Chinese dominance in the South China Sea. I also I see some unprecedented opportunity. We have Vietnam chairing ASEAN this year. We have increasing activity on the part of all the maritime ASEAN countries, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, against unprecedented Chinese harassment. And so if there were a credible U.S. leadership that said that, we should have made this statement about illegality 4 years ago after the Hague decision that demonstrated that this is what I call fantasy irredentism on the part of China. But it's better late than never. If we could build that, what if the U.S. worked with Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and drafted a code of conduct for the Western Pacific and took it to the EAS and forced China either negotiate or be totally exposed and isolated? So I would view that as kind of a win-win. But we haven't really been there's no diplomatic imagination that's been applied to this problem.
Dr. Hayton, in terms of the American presence there, and when you're talking about those two carrier groups, Chinese were having their drills as well. Taiwan, we haven't even talked about. In terms of, you point out the American presence as a double-edged sword in terms of deterrence or escalation.
Well, that was something that a Malaysian colleague said to me when I was doing the research for the interview, and their concern was that that a confrontation might happen, but of course the problem for the Southeast Asians was that the US might get distracted by a bigger crisis somewhere else, but of course China is always there, and China has built literally three navies.
Staying power that you're referring to, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, and China really has three significant naval forces to draw on. It has its navy, it has a large Coast Guard fleet, and it also has a maritime militia. and these forces, particularly the last two, are designed to just hang around and wait for an opportunity, whereas the US Navy is designed to go places, do something, and then leave again. And so the problem is that in the South China Sea, particularly with these artificial island bases, China has quite a lot of home advantage versus a US Navy that's wanting to play a long game. And so really it's up to the Southeast Asians to try to put forward their claims, but they don't feel strong enough to do so alone. So they need support from as many different outside players as possible. The US, but also India, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Britain potentially. But then actually all these, and as Robert was saying, this only starts to make sense if all these countries work together towards a common aim. I mean, if the US turns up for some exercises 1 week and then goes away again, and then Japan turns up, and that could either be completely uncoordinated, or it could be done in a structured way with all these countries working together.
Mr. Manning, you are calling this an opportunity now. Like Dr. Hayton is pointing out, it will only be an opportunity if everyone works concertedly or together in this. You've seen a white paper by the Japanese Defense Forces now, where they're talking about China. You've seen Australia announcing a huge increase in its defense budget. There are reports that Australia may be invited by India to join what's called the Malabar exercises, which is coordinated in some form or manner. But like Dr. Hayton is pointing out, it needs to be concerted. How do you impose a cost or change behavior from Beijing?
Yeah, well, I think as Bill pointed out, there's really limited effectiveness of sanctions. I think there needs to be some really creative diplomacy. I think one of the problems even on the military side is that the Pentagon invests in the wrong technologies. Suppose, for example, we had invested in a fleet of several hundred underwater drones and had a drone stalking every Chinese boat in the area. And every time they crossed a disputed territory or into some country's economic or zone, we sprayed them with yellow fluorescent paint and filmed it. I mean, I don't know what, that would put the Chinese in a fairly interesting position. But there's no creativity either on the military side or the diplomatic side. But I still think it's possible. This issue is not going away. A new administration could sit down with the maritime ASEAN powers, Japan, Australia, and others, and come up with a diplomatic strategy that would pursue this, because it's important to demonstrate clearly that there's no legal basis for China's beliefs. They've made this up. My favorite line is when they say this has been Chinese fishing grounds since ancient times. So of course there were never any Malaysian, Vietnamese, Indonesian, or Filipino fishermen. It's absurd, right? And yet I think it should be, it deserves a pie in the face every time they say it. And so there are things we could do, but at the end of the day, I think Xi Jinping is making a lot of big strategic mistakes and overreaching, and I think we're starting to see the costs begin to mount up. And I've watched China for many decades, and in the past, they're not stupid like the United States. They wouldn't be stuck fighting a losing war in Afghanistan for 20 years. When they make a mistake, they're usually fairly pragmatic, and they figure it out and correct it. This is the first time when they've done across the board, whether it's economic coercion against Europe or military coercion in the South China Sea. They're just across the board assertiveness. The interesting question to me is why the Communist Party at this point feels a need to do this. And I think there's a lot of speculation that the COVID-19 response is really a big blow to their legitimacy. And so they're playing the nationalist card on steroids right now to to compensate for it, because otherwise, from a hardcore Chinese national interest point of view, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Dr. Hayton, just going back to all your work, which even up to 2014 in your seminal book, if you could explain to people who may not be really familiar with the 9-dash line and what's happening in what Mr. Manning was talking about, the Chinese historical claims, how you go back and you find a translation error which is possibly responsible for the southernmost claim that China has in terms of a sandbank and shoals and what is underwater and what is under on the sea and an island. If you could explain that in terms of EEZ and the 200 nautical miles and the 12 nautical miles for territorial sea, simply.
Okay, that's quite a lot of material, but I'll do my best. What I wanted to show in my research was that China developed its claim to the South China Sea islands in an atmosphere of ignorance. It didn't know very much about the South China Sea when this claim emerged, and it made lots of mistakes. And so a lot of this language that we hear from Chinese officials about ancient times and 2,000 years and the first to name it, this is all language that was made up during the 20th century. What I've tried to show is that the Chinese claim into the islands of the South China Sea emerged in a 40-year period between 1907 and 1947. There's nothing any earlier than that. And in 1946 was the first time any Chinese official ever stuck a flag in an island in the StratNews, for example. And so my favorite line on this is that China's claim to the Spratly Islands is younger than my own parents. This isn't an ancient times claim. It's actually very modern. And China has never, no state really, apart from perhaps Japan during the Second World War, has ever controlled the whole South China Sea. It's always been a mixed up place with people from different parts of the world. I mean, going back centuries, you had, merchants from India, from Iran, from the other parts of the Middle East trading with China, using the South China Sea as well as everybody else involved. It's always been a multinational place. What has changed, more recently is that we had all of the countries of the world pretty much in 1982 agreed this thing called UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they did so because they wanted to try to find a way to divide up the world's sea resources fairly. And basically what UNCLOS says is that if you have a coastline, you are entitled to, up to 200 nautical miles out from your coast for the resources that lie within it. It's not your territory, but you have, access to or rights to the resources. What China is trying to do, despite the fact that China negotiated that treaty, signed it, and then ratified it, is to try to go beyond it and say, well, actually, we want more than what it says in UNCLOS. And we want the other countries to share what are supposed to be their exclusive economic zones. We want to have joint development. But joint development is not something that they offer to other countries in their own exclusive economic zone. They don't say, well, share the water off Hainan Island with Vietnam, for example. Joint development is something that only happens in other people's exclusive economic zones. And so the Southeast Asians, despite decades of pressure, have said no to joint development consistently. Now, the real problem becomes is that China has claimed bits of the South China Sea as territory where there isn't actually any territory. And the main ones are the James Shoal in the very southern part of the South China Sea, which is close to Borneo, and another one called the Vanguard Bank in English, which is a bit closer towards Vietnam. And my research has led me to the conclusion that this is a complete mix-up, an accident. And in 1933, 34, 35, when a Chinese government committee was looking at the South China Sea, they mistranslated an English map which has these names shoals, and shoal is an old English word that means shallow. And they didn't really know what this meant, and so they gave it a word tan, a Chinese equivalent tan, but tan means sandbank, and the sandbank could be below the water or above the water. And then somebody else came along a couple of years later and said, oh, well, look, it's a tan, it must be a sandbank, it must be territory, it must be ours, and then drew a line around it. And then that professor's students were then hired by the Chinese government at the end of the Second World War to advise the government on which parts of the South China Sea they should claim after the defeat of Japan. And they said, well, that's a sandbank and that's a sandbank, well, we'll draw a line around it and we'll claim it. even though there isn't actually any territory there. So this is the reason why we now have Chinese ships patrolling the James Shoal and the Vanguard Bank, thousands, over 1,000 kilometers, away from the Chinese coastline. Underwater features, there's no territory there, but China has this sort of silly idea that this is inherently Chinese territory. And so you have this ridiculous situation, really, where potentially there could be a war over a non-existent island because somebody made a mistake back in the 1930s.
Mr. Manning, Dr. Hayton was talking about UNCLOS. Now, we've seen the Chinese, not just in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea, and not just vis-a-vis UNCLOS, not respecting the rule of law in international law. But UNCLOS itself, am I correct in saying that the US still has to formally ratify it?
Well, the U.S. is in a difficult position because China has signed and ratified it. So they're on the executive board. They have a seat at the table. The U.S., ironically, has more accurately observed UNCLOS than China, but it's never ratified the treaty. So, there's a bit of perceived hypocrisy here. Recently, for example, China was going to be put on the executive board, and the Americans protested. But how do you protest an agreement you wouldn't join? Even though they're not incorrect in the absurdity of China, which has clearly said that their domestic laws and claims supersede the treaty, even though that's not how international law works. And so we're in this odd situation. That's why I'm saying I think based on the Hague decision, we have a strong international legal position to just make a mockery of these Chinese claims, because in the end they're left with nothing but raw power, and that's really what's going on now.
Dr. Hayton, I don't really want to comment on India specifically, but after what's happened on the line of action control in Ladakh and the Himalayas, there's been a lot of talk about pushback that India is, whether it's on land borders or in the sea, and there is a perception among some strategists that India might have a little bit larger stake in the Indian Ocean, maybe not all the way to the South China Sea, but in terms of the choke points that the Chinese have, both near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and then of course the Malacca Straits. But as both of you have pointed out, it can't be an individual country that does that if it comes to that. How do you visualize pressure being put on China, or at least the threat of that pressure being put on China, whether it's those choke points which control its cargo, its oil, its energy, everything that it's really bringing in?
I should say that I'm not an expert on the India-China border, but what I've looked at is the way that China developed its ideas about territory and borders. And actually, this is part of a book that I've written, which is coming out in October. And I think the consequence of that is that China has this fundamentalist, the modern state of China has this fundamentalist attitude towards boundaries. And there's been this belief that's been passed down, deliberately, inculcated, that in the past China was humiliated by other countries taking away bits of territory, and that this line that the People's Republic of China inherited is absolutely sacred and must be defended, and every little inch of that territory must be recovered, whether it's in the Himalayas or in the South China Sea or Hong Kong or Taiwan. And it's actually the territory that is important, even though this is a piece of, might be a piece of absolutely barren mountain with no, agricultural or other value to it whatsoever, or coral reefs, that can support no life whatsoever. It's become this sort of almost religious feeling that because it's territory, it has to be recovered. And my research, leads me to the conclusion that the Chinese government had no idea where its boundaries were. In the 1930s, it was sort of making it up as it went along, and these kind of lines were drawn. In some places, they were fixed because Britain or France or Russia had obliged the previous Qing Empire to make an agreement. But a lot of this, in many places, it was just invented. And so the idea that people are now killing and dying over these, very small scraps of land, just absurd. But obviously, the Xi Jinping government feels this is important, and no doubt that they are willing to sacrifice, people's lives, for these, very tiny amounts of territory, because it makes them feel better and it makes them look like they are the heirs of the victory of 1949, and they're going to sort of reunify the whole country, and that obviously has a domestic audience. It's about national pride and so forth. So that's one point. The other point, of course, is that China's overall relations with India, and the fact that China has this connection with Pakistan, and then Vietnam has to think about India has to think about how it can balance that. Is it going to work with Vietnam in the same way that China works with Pakistan? All these kind of things I think are important issues. I mean, it used to be that we would hopefully see a way that Asia could work together. And I think you mentioned you'd had Kishore Mahbubani on your program in the past, who obviously likes to talk about an Asian century. But it isn't looking very good at the moment, frankly. I mean, there's these latent issues seem to be coming to the surface and disrupting any hope of some kind of united Asian future.
But Mr. Manning, united they need to be against the Chinese threat, especially when we're talking about South China Sea and how important it is for energy and exports and imports for China. Are those areas where I was mentioning about the choke points? Are those vulnerabilities something that the country should be looking at collectively if the situation warrants it?
Right. Well, in peacetime, there really isn't a threat. The Chinese are as dependent on those sea lanes of commerce as anybody else, in fact, more so. Obviously, in a military conflict, there'd be major vulnerabilities. And I think the U.S. is looking at what I would call counter anti-access policies, because that's what the Chinese are trying to do. They're trying to use these territories and their maritime capabilities to raise the cost of the United States intervening in the area. And so I think the U.S. is looking at, can we station missiles around them, anti-ship missiles, to counter that? And I think that's something that the U.S. will be talking with Japan and a number of ASEAN states about over time, because the issue cuts both ways. And I think this is part of a larger problem that we're in this free fall, tit for tat, death cycle with China. And because the old assumptions, the one thing there's a bipartisan consensus on in Washington is that all the assumptions we've had about China were wrong. But we have an attitude, we don't have a new policy, and there's no framework. Two nuclear weapon states need to have some red lines. We had a framework of restraint with Russia during the depths of the Cold War, although it took a near-death experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis to get there. Yeah. And my fear, as U.S. and Chinese forces are increasingly bumping up against each other, that it's going to take some kind of catastrophe before both sides reach a new sobriety and realize no matter how much they see each other as competitors, at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of competitive coexistence, and we need to set the terms of it. And that hasn't happened yet. And it's gotten even more complicated because Trump is running against China. And so he's imposed this demonological campaign theme onto an already difficult policy. So I suspect it's going to get worse before it gets better. And we may well see some confrontations in the region.
Dr. Hayton, Mr. Manning is saying it's a free fall without a framework, anti-China framework. How do you visualize this panning out?
Well, for me, the strange thing is, just how many mistakes and missteps China has made since sort of 2009, really. I mean, you look at when sort of Obama first took office, he, was talking about, working together to solve the world's problems. And obviously this was after the financial crisis and all the rest of it. And it seems that at that moment, China somehow kind of started to believe its own propaganda and thought that this was its time, that it was going to start, running the world in effect. And everything it's done since then has annoyed people. I mean, the UK was was installing Huawei telecom equipment at that time and continued to do so, and was kind of wary of China, I suppose, but at a very small level, just concerned with people with the security service. But now the whole country is talking about Huawei and whether it's a risk or not, and has taken this decision. China's actions in the South China Sea have alienated most people in Southeast Asia, when before everybody thought of China as this benign trading partner. So the question is, will any of this start to have an impact in China itself? When the Chinese leadership goes for their August summer holiday discussions, are they actually going to sort of turn around and say to Xi Jinping, are you sure this is going the right way? Or has he kind of basically surrounded himself with yes men who are only going to tell him that everybody loves China now, and finally China's getting the respect that it needs? Because it's we're in a situation now where I think there are very few countries where people look at China as a benign player now, and they're all suspicion and hostility is rising, and that's not because we've all been told what to think by Donald Trump. It's because people in different countries have come to their own conclusions based on Chinese behavior.
Dr. Bill Hayton and Mr. Robert A. Manning, thank you so much for joining us on this discussion. I suspect there'll be a lot more on this subject. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care.
And for all our viewers, you can just log on to stratnewsglobal.com to get all the latest news and views, as well as analysis from an Indian perspective. Follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and Instagram on our accounts, and just click on that bell icon on YouTube if you want to get reminders for videos like this. You've been watching Talking Point on Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh.